Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Carroll, the Executive Director for the Jeffco DeAngelis Foundation. We're pleased to welcome you to listen in on this very important discussion about what schools and school districts should be asking themselves as they consider a return to school, what that might look like for their students, staff, and their community. The Foundation is dedicated to supporting training in crisis preparation, response, and recovery for schools, school districts, and first responders. Much like this conversation today, we believe students, staff, and community safety is tightly tied to how well we prepare and how well we coordinate with our partners from all reaches of the community. We are coming to you today from the Frank DeAngelis Center for Community Safety. This unique training center is owned by Jefferson County Schools, but is used as a training facility for first responders from all over the state of Colorado, and in fact, some people from across the nation. To date, we've served 70 different agencies, and over 7,200 first responders have trained here. As we get into our discussion today, it's really important to remember that no matter the size of your community, parents have the same demand of schools and school districts. And that is, I want my child to be safe and educated, and safe in all ways, with regular safety and security that we think of, but also health and mental health as well. Because there is no higher calling than serving the students that we are entrusted with each day. With that, I am pleased to have our guests today introduce themselves to you. We're going to start with Mr. McDonald.
I'm John McDonald, the Executive Director for the Department of School Safety for Jeffco Schools. I've been with Jeffco Schools now for almost 13 years, and prior to that I spent a career in the private sector as a Senior Manager of U.S. Investigations and Security, and then prior to that, law enforcement. So I'm happy to be here and talking with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Tim Reed. I'm a sergeant with Westminster PD in Colorado. Westminster is a little bit unique in that we serve 2 counties, 4 school districts. We have a junior college, so we're a pretty unique and busy team as the SROs. I've been in law enforcement for 25 years now, most of it at Westminster, and I'm glad to be here also.
My name is Ben Tennyson. I'm a captain with West Metro Fire. West Metro Fire encompasses Wheat Ridge, Lakewood, and a portion of unincorporated Jefferson County. We also go down into a little bit of Douglas County in the Roxborough area. I've been with West Metro for 15 years now.
I'm Julie Wilkin. I'm the Director of Health Services for Jeffco Public Schools, also the COVID-19 Incident Commander for Jeffco Public Schools. I've been with the district about 6 years now, and prior to that I was in the private sector. I have about 22 years of nursing behind me, mostly in OR, ER, and ICU services, so and a little bit of management behind that too.
And as I had mentioned, I'm Kevin Carroll, the Executive Director for the Foundation. I come from 31 years in education. 16 of those were as a principal at all 3 levels, elementary school, middle school, and high school. And then at the end of my career for the last 4 years, I was the Chief Student Success Officer for Jeffco Schools. Included in that role was being the incident commander for the district. And then I was glad to join the DeAngelis Foundation as I moved into non-retirement retirement. So I'm glad that you all are here for this important discussion. As you're all keenly aware, we've been thrust into very uncertain times with continually shifting information and guidelines. In times such as these, it is important to frame our thinking with key questions. At the same time, it's important to know that there are no right answers or proven approaches to rely on. For those of you watching, please know that we will be posting this conversation on our website so that you can go back and share these things with your teams and your community as you think about what may or may not work for you as a community. We'll touch on several questions today, but we certainly will not be able to cover all of those things that you should be thinking about as a district. This is just a starter, something to get you thinking about. So you may hear some things today that are a really good fit for you and your community. You may hear some things that you say, in our community, there's no way that this would work given the constraints that we're operating under. So keep that in mind as you listen. That will be posted at www.deangeliscenter.org. As the group explores some key questions I'll toss their way today, I am asking them to consider things through the official roles and titles that you just heard about, but I'm also asking that they think as community members, family members, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, because we know that schools and school districts are the heart of the community, and it takes all of us working together to make things work well for our students. As we begin, I'd like to have you all just share a little bit about just this idea of when parents drop their kids off to us, that is their most precious resource, right? Their children, we are responsible for keeping them safe and secure. So it's important that schools and school districts consider how it is that they will instill confidence in the community. How will they communicate? How will they actively involve and engage families in this important discussion? So what are some of your thoughts about that? Because that's the bedrock that everything starts from. How is it that we're partnering with community and families as they drop their students off?
You know, I'll just start by saying that we've been in the school safety planning business for more than 20 years now. But we are now finding ourselves in completely uncharted territory, in an area we've never even really talked about. Bird flu was out there, H1N1 was out there in the past, but it was never really a big deal. Obviously, this is a really big deal, and we're making decisions we've never had to make before. School districts are being inundated with information from public health, a group that we typically don't work with day to day. Our mission partners in schools are law enforcement and fire. And that's who we typically work with on any given day. So that encompasses a big part of our planning. And you know, now to find ourselves in a position where we're trying to communicate, build processes and protocols, plans and operational guidance at a time when we had to first shut down and then move to a completely new learning environment, and now ramp up before the next school year, it's a challenge. And you know, communication is key to everything. And you're not always going to be successful at it. That doesn't mean you don't keep trying, but it's a frustration for everybody. And we understand that it's a frustration for us too, because one day we'll come out with information, the next day it changes based on new learnings.
That's one of the things that I was going to say. It's hard with communication when it feels like the ball keeps moving. And maybe, Julie, you can speak a little bit to how the health departments change their guidelines based on what they're learning along the way. So it makes sense that things are changing, but it's even though it's frustrating.
It's very frustrating. You know, regardless of what the state puts out as part of their public health orders, we are truly guided, and each county is guided by their local health department. So even though overall the state may say, here's our guidance and this is how we're directing the state, our local health department and our partners at Jefferson County Public Health may say, yes, but in our region, we're showing a little bit different statistics. We're showing a little bit different data. And because of that, we're going to give you guys a little bit different advice and a little bit of different guidance. I do have weekly, sometimes daily meetings with them, and we talk about the things that we've seen so far. We talk about you know, the positive cases that we've had for children under the age of 20, what those have looked like, how they've presented, and then what the likelihood is of how we're going to see those once school starts into session again. So we're trying to weigh all those options. Obviously, it is a balance between education and public health, and we recognize that if, you know, being in school for children is public health, because if we let them stay out of school for any length of time, we're going to have many, many, many concerns that far outweigh the effects of the virus. So really the safest place, and we truly believe, I think all of us at Jeffco Public Schools truly believe that the right place for them is inside our school buildings, and we are here to take care of them and make sure they're safe.
So one of the most important things I hear you saying is that it's important to work with your local health departments.
Yes.
To be able to know what the local guidelines are, because you might see something on television, read something in the paper, on the internet, and you see something statewide, and it may not be true for your area, so you don't want to rush ahead as a school district and make plans based on that, but instead make sure you're partnering with them along the way.
They are your partners.
Great.
You have to keep working with them.
We're going to talk about other great partners too. So what some avenues for communicating how things are different and instilling that confidence in the community. What are some tools that you might recommend that districts consider from that view as an emergency responder, a parent, anybody?
Well, one of the things that we did at West Metro with the evolving situation, at least for our line personnel, is we had a central resource where we could go and get the newest updated information. So it wasn't necessarily that you had to spread everything and communicate it out to everybody, but you had a central resource where you could go to and you could see that newest information, because like we were saying, this whole situation was fluid, and what one day was true, the next day was not true. And that was really helpful for us as we kind of molded our response and how we would treat our responders and what we needed to worry about when we were screening ourselves and things of that nature. So that single point of contact and that resource where you could research that was very helpful for us.
Great. I know the local district here has set up a COVID-19 kind of website where people can go to check. Sometimes that becomes a little bit overwhelming though, because there's so much data there. So as districts and agencies start to consider how it is they're going to share with people, some type of prioritizing. Here's the latest information, here's the most important information, or even categorizing based on type of user, right? Students really need to know this right now.
Yeah.
Parents need to know this right now. Responders need to know this right now.
Or here's information that's no longer valid,
Right.
right? So you can completely ignore that rumor or that information that you got, and this is the best information that we have right now.
So kind of a Mythbusters kind of
Yeah.
section, right? So people have the latest information. Great. Part of effective crisis response planning and preparation hinges on bringing lessons learned forward, right, from prior experiences. If you each could speak a little bit about your reflections from lessons that we learned this spring. While those lessons are still fresh, they probably can help inform us as we think about what the fall might look like.
I'll just start by saying I think the single biggest lesson learned from my perspective was remember that in our business we're used to being that type A personality that leads the response to critical events, but we have to check our own egos at the door. And in our case, we transitioned our incident command system, and Julie became the incident commander, because it's not a world that any of us have ever been in. Wouldn't know the first thing about an infectious disease. So by making that change, it really allowed us to focus on fixing the problem. And in every crisis, there's an ebb and a flow. I call it the fives: 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days. Eventually it ends. There's no ending here, at least that we've seen so far. And we don't have an end date, so you get crisis management weary, especially in a world of education where you just want to get back to the learning. And we can't do that in this case. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, and I think that this was so much different for especially the partners at the table. We work together regularly, however, never with this magnitude, right? Never have we had all levels of government engaged in trying to provide a service under an emergency operations umbrella, right? Even 9/11, that was a localized event. This, we're across the nation, we're worldwide, and in Westminster for us, every department, every division was impacted, and every department and every division contributed to the resource list. And John and I've talked about this many times. The first rule of emergency management is alignment, right? We have to be scripting under the same mission, values, and operations. And so that was a big lift for all of us. We stretched our boundaries beyond anywhere that we've ever been before. And we've had major incidents in the Denver metro area, obviously. This was more than that.
So in our work as a foundation, part of the crisis response is all about that we're sure that we're talking to our community partners so that when we do have to respond to something, it is in unison, right? We've learned that lesson over and over and over again in so many different incidents that if we're not well coordinated, bad things happen. And so ahead of time, we want to encourage all school districts to work with their partners and talk through from their lens. Everybody's trying to take care of their lane right now, make sure it's all good and all secure so they can say, we're doing our part, and not necessarily reaching out beyond their part to their other partners who are going to have to respond together. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but any thoughts on that from you all?
I would just kind of piggyback onto what you said about, everybody coming together. Well, I think something that we've learned as an organization is that putting all departments together matters. I've gotten to know people that worked in different departments just from being incident commander here for this, that I didn't work with often before. And now, every single job task that person has matters. And it really takes that unification for all departments to come together, because that's what's going to create the force to get everything done. We have really worked on, aligning terms, just even terminology, to make sure everybody's on the same page, and so that when we communicate something, we're really communicating in the same aspect. I think that's something that I personally have learned over the last 4 or 5 months, is that, every position in this district matters, and I've gotten the opportunity, which has been great, to work with positions I never knew beforehand. And learned that their position matters in all of this.
So that's part of the challenge and the struggle and the beauty of working in a school district that's so large, right? 85,000 students, 14,000 employees, 750 square miles, right? But for our smaller districts, our rural districts, sometimes it's one person who has multiple roles. It's common. So then in times like this, it's important that there is a chance for executive leaders to sit down with their folks and prioritize. During this time of response, we need you to really focus on this, and this is how we're going to shift our priorities and maybe shift some of our roles, because to take on all of these new unknowns, one person who may already have 5 different jobs that they're doing, and they're driving the bus, right? We'll talk about buses in a little while. It's a unique challenge. Ben, you were...
Well, and I think some of that is your individual group's reality. West Metro's reality of what we can do is different than what Pleasant View, what Golden, what Denver. There's so many different things that we're able to do that maybe they can't, or maybe they're able to do that we can't, based on whether it's resources or personnel or expertise. And I think one of the important things is you have to tailor make your response to what your resources allow. So whether it's a funding thing on PPE or personnel that you can commit to an incident, I think that's a very valid thing, that there's some good things going on in other places, and you may have to mold that to what your individual situation fits.
And often when we reach out to our partners and find out they're doing different things too, we don't have to duplicate the work. Go, wow, you guys really have made some progress on what kind of PPE guidelines we should be looking at. Let's learn from that instead of trying to recreate that. Yeah, that's a great point. I want to go back a little bit to something that John said. So the life cycle of a crisis, 10 seconds, 10 minutes, 10 days, right? And this going on for a longer extended period of time with no real light at the end of the tunnel as far as the end. What is it that you're thinking about or seeing in the people that you work with that type of a crisis is having an impact with? I'm just thinking crisis fatigue. What are some of those implications?
Well, I mean, I can speak for us. I know that PPE is a big fatigue issue for us, and it's been one that we've had to be adaptive with, because we've gone through several different measures of PPE based on what's happening, and we've found challenges working in certain gear that it's just something that you have to continue to hammer home, that the importance of wearing your PPE. The big issue for us is that it's extremely hot in some of the PPE that we have. You're sweating and you're wearing goggles, and your vision is cut off. So that's a challenge, to keep your people wearing the appropriate PPE for their safety, as well as not passing it on to others. And so we've been adaptive, and whenever we've made a change, we've had to consider that, does it still provide adequate protection? We kind of understand the problems with it, and is it a problem that we need to deal with, or is it something that we can create a solution to? I think the fatigue of, specifically wearing the mask, we're lucky enough that a lot of times they're on calls, whereas if you are working a job where you're wearing a mask all day, that can be even more cumbersome. So as things go on, I think the diligence of people and the attention to detail is one thing that tends to fall off a little
Getting
bit.
a little slack with it, or resistance to it.
Exactly,
Like
and
you're saying, can't see, I'm sweating, I'm hot.
Yep, and it's important to
Okay.
remember how the reasons why you're doing those things and why you're wearing that PPE or doing the specific task.
PPE is a challenge, not just for the user, but also for that relationship, right? From the law enforcement perspective, when we're coming in and everything we do is about relationship, whether it's a formal or some type of consultative or compassionate, that mask in between as a barrier to communication is really hard sometimes. And one of the things you mentioned about the timeline of this, one of the things that humans want is closure, right? John and I, when we approach each other, it's so normal, hey, how you doing? And when we leave, handshakes, right? That closure, that opening is so important, and these things are boundaries to that. And so I think those types of simple things are adding to the overall anxiety as we go on with this, 17 days now in, something like that. There's not only fatigue from just the overall process, but also some kind of compassion fatigue of, okay, here we're going to go deal with this again. We'd like just to get back to normal where we can have those conversations, that contact with normal relationships with people.
And a lot of our communication is nonverbal, right? With facial expressions, right? John, you had something you were saying.
I also think from what I've noticed is informational overload is really impacting organization, multiple organizations, and people and community. And it's just constant. It's a constant barrage. It's adding stress.
And an extreme urgency to
yes.
every conversation.
And so then you get pushback. I'm done with this.
So when everything's urgent, nothing's urgent.
urgent.
Yeah, they get that kind of fatigue. Okay.
We've got to watch that. You got to give people some breaks, and people have to have a little downtime. It's critically important in every crisis, and following every crisis, that everybody can step away before you get back into it. In this case, there's really nowhere to go other than isolating at home.
At home.
And,
right, where
and
we've
that
all been.
becomes a struggle.
Yeah. So you both mentioned PPE. We kind of went there a little bit. Now let's think about that in the school setting. What are some of those implications, right? The teacher who has that relationship with the kids and doesn't want those barriers, but knows that they need to be there. And how do we explain that to a 5-year-old, 8-year-old? What expectations or what kind of questions should we be asking about what kids should have and teachers should have? So maybe some questions that you all have been wrestling with.
Yeah, we've actually been wrestling with that a lot. From early on, the teachers had approached us and asked us, is there any way we can get rid of the masks and wear face shields? Because we heard face shields were okay. It's important that the kids, especially in the early years, when they're forming their sounds and learning their consonants and their vowels and their reading, it's important that they see the mouth move. So we really worked hard over the last couple months pushing on public health a little bit to say, the research and the evidence of a face shield is not quite there yet. We know that there are still respiratory droplets that come out from under, and we know that that's not a confinement like the mask is. So we've been trying to work with what are there different types of face shields and we have found a few that we have seen. Rather than just the regular one that covers the face, there are some that come around the neck and go upward.
Go up, okay.
So you do have a little bit better barrier underneath. We feel like that would be a really good option for our teachers, some of our speech language pathologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and we feel like that's a good alternative. What we've asked them to do if they don't have a mask on, with the face shield, is still stay 6 feet from the students. If they go up to the students, then we've asked them to put on a mask, and the students will have a mask on too. We're trying to see right now if maybe one of those face shields that has the lower protection part, if they can do away without the masks
Okay.
for that.
I've heard that some school districts have been talking about that in terms of students with disabilities too, like deaf and hard of hearing students who lip read.
Right.
Yeah.
So that will be a challenge with them too. Some of the other, as far as the PPE that we don't think about all the time, are the sneeze guards or the plexiglass. You know, we've thought about that for a lot of our special education programs, and you know, tried to see how can we do tabletop ones that can turn and they can do different directions, and that way, even some of them have armholes in them, so that the provider can actually stand behind a shield and put their arms through
Like
while
at the grocery
still,
store where I push
Right.
my money through, right? Or
Right.
my credit card through.
and that way they're still having contact and they can still touch with the child if they need to. So we've been working on all that.
As a parent with 2 kids, I can only imagine what a room full of kids, the amount of effort that it's going to take teachers to remind kids to put their masks
Mask
on or
not
to
on
keep
the
them
head
out.
or
or-
on the, yeah, being
I-
used as a slingshot or.
I can't imagine how much time that's going to take out of a teacher's day, but I mean, it's going to be important. But that is going to be a struggle for teachers, I imagine.
So that makes a good point. The types of things that we're talking with students about to help make sense of it for them and why that it is important, but without instilling a sense of panic in them, right? We don't want them to be anxious. We want them to be educated and be smart about things, but not be worried about things at the same time. So I would say that's probably true for a lot of the different procedures that school districts are thinking about. What does hand washing stations look like? What does the regular going to the restroom look like, right? How do you walk through the halls? We'll get to some of those specifics here in a minute, but talking with kids ahead of time and doing it in a way that helps them learn as opposed to just beating them down for it, right?
So one thing we've talked about along those lines is setting up, in fact, next week, we're going to set up a few model schools. And we're going to put the signage up and we're going to work with the principals on each of those schools. And then we're going to do a video called A Day in the Life of the Jeffco Student. And we're going to walk them through, what does this look like? Get from everything from getting on the bus to getting their meals during the day to going into classrooms and having them see real life on a video what this will look like.
I think that's a great opportunity for not only staff, right, principals to see how do I set up my school,
Right.
staff to see that, but for kids to be able to look at it and see it, and parents. If we go back to our first question about how do you instill confidence, it's through information. And for a parent and a kid to be able to look at something like that and say, this is going to be all right.
Yep.
It's going to be different, but we get to be back in school. So interesting to think about a model classroom, and that's something that could be replicated in a lot of different districts too. Okay. We talked a little bit about symptom screening, but I'd like each of you to talk about from an employee standpoint right now. We'll get to schools in a minute, but for year-round employees in school districts and for people who are in first responder roles and safety and security role, what do your symptom screening policies look like and procedures right now so people can get kind of a feel?
We're currently screening any employee as they arrive for that day's service. It's a symptom check and a thermometer check. We also are really pushing employees, if you don't feel well, stay at home. So that's a real simple check. Most of the time, if somebody's over the temperature, it's because they've been in the hot car or they just finished exercising. So we can make some accommodation for that and have some reason with these conversations. I think the other part of this that's really important is not just the screening, but it's the responsibility of everyone in the organization to not just do face coverings. Face covering is one part of a multi-pronged strategy, right? Washing your hands, social distancing, all those other things that when we put that together as a package, that is really what helps the public health crisis that we're dealing with. And so, we still use shared computer workstations in Westminster, right? Our patrol division, they come in, doesn't make sense to have 60 computers back there. But each individual has the responsibility to clean on their way out and on their way
Way
in.
in, too.
So we've really reinforced those things, and to everyone's surprise, we've not had many people infected. We're both in really high-risk categories.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
we're going to choose to help that person over our own safety sometimes, right? Okay, I can't put on PPE right now, I'm gonna do that. So we have all these things on the back end that help.
So when you say symptom screening, lots of people think, well, that's just taking your temperature. What is that other piece when you say symptom screen?
There's 4 questions, basically. Have you felt any illness? Do you have a dry cough? Do you have a sore throat? Those types of things. And those are all laid out in the public health guidelines. It's real simple for anybody to mimic that.
Okay. Ben, how about your team?
It's very similar. Whenever, and we have 2 different kind of areas. We have our admin areas and we have our station areas. Whenever we come to work that morning, it's the station officer's responsibility to get a temp check on all of the employees, and then we also go through an employee screening. And that has been fluid as we've gone along, as we found out, for instance, that sense of smell was a new symptom. We added that to our screening. So we record that, and it's, we have a record of all employees who have come to work, and every 24 hours that's done. So for instance, we work a 48-hour shift. The morning of our second shift, we do the same thing all over again.
Okay.
And even if we have a slightly elevated temperature, but it's not in that fever range, if we have a slightly elevated, we're required to wear a mask so that if we are starting to get sick or come down with something, we don't expose those around us for it. And then we are required to have hourly screenings so that we see if that temperature is going up. If that's the case,
Hourly.
yes, you're gonna head home. So we definitely are concerned about that. Any contractor who comes into our station, they get screened as well. They've got to wear masks as well. And a lot of that is because we're going into people's homes or we're going into hospitals. And for us to transmit that around, same as police officers, it would be bad. And then the same screening form goes for our admin, our day employees.
And you have to remember with the masks, as inconvenient as it is, what it really is a sign of mutual respect, right? I'm not going to contaminate you, and you're not going to contaminate me, and we're both in this together.
How about John for your team?
Well, we're doing a lot of the same type of things. And the one thing I think we're all doing also is providing our patrol people the ability to clean their cars because they share vehicles. And we've got to make sure that, that cleaning, whether it's on a computer, a work table, a shared work table, or a vehicle, has to be done religiously. I mean, it is something that we do before and after each shift. We've set up the symptom screening based on the recommendations from Julie, and we're following those to the letter, because I think once you fail in having a consistent model, that's where people start sliding through, and then all of a sudden you get a contamination occurring and you get people sick.
And that's what we worry about with that crisis fatigue, right?
It is.
People going,
Absolutely.
Right? And then for you, Julie, for year-round employees who
Yep.
are not
It's
safety
pretty much
security?
similar situations is what these guys refer to. We do at all of our administration buildings right now, because it's the summer, we do have it set up when they first enter the door. They are getting asked 5 questions. They're getting their temperature taken. Tim, you brought up a good point about the thermometers that I wanted to touch with a little bit. So nationwide, the thermometers have been at a sparse, right? We have barely been able to get them in our hands nationwide. Ordering them at the mass amounts that we're ordering, and it's not just our organization, but other organizations too, what they're doing is mass producing mostly the infrared thermometers, which are contactless. What they're doing is measuring your core temperature from the temporal artery right here in your forehead. So as somebody is taking your temperature through the forehead, whether it's, right now it's the summertime, it's really hot. Earlier in all of this, March and April, it was cold out. We had snowy days, frigid weather, It does sometimes give you a false reading depending on the heat or coldness of your skin. So with that being said, it's not, immediately you take that first temperature, that may not be the first temperature. If you think it's too low or too high, it's important to have that person sit out for a couple minutes, maybe drink a glass of water, especially if they're telling you, I feel fine, I'm good. Have them sit out just for a few minutes and retake that temperature.
See if there's any
We're-
change.
Yeah, we will have thermometer duds throughout all of this. That's, we can't avoid that. But we're really looking for that consistency that John was talking about. So it's important that we keep doing the same procedures everywhere we go.
And you've been looking at some unique places for thermometers too, right? As opposed to just the traditional places.
We did. We actually purchased most of ours through a food vendor rather than a health supply vendor.
So that might be good advice for a school district
That's
who's
right.
running into short supplies places. They might think about other vendors that might also
That's right.
produce. Let's shift now to kids upon entry into school and what questions schools and school districts should be thinking about, what that could look like and feel like and sound like.
Julie
So
answered.
again, we really want to, again, I would, recommend to everybody that they work with their local public health agency. We have come to the agreement that you can't ask a 5-year-old all of the questions that we're normally asking an adult, right? We have gotten the agreement that we can ask them down to one question about how they're feeling if they have a cough or fever recently. Again, that may work with, it should work with all kids, but maybe there may be a little bit of issues with the littler kids. We don't know that until we try it. We have to try it and we have to start somewhere. So we're going to start with that kind of process where the kids are coming into the building and they're getting asked that question, they're getting their temperatures taken, and then they'll be going into their classroom. They will be masked as they come up and get their temperature and ask that question.
Then we'll want to think about, like I had mentioned earlier, those special populations, right? Where a student
Yes.
may be non-communicative, right? How are we going to know? Obviously, the communication with the parent is going to be significant. Other nuances that you've been thinking about or you wonder if they might be an issue, one of the things I wonder about is with a very large school, how long is it going to take you to screen kids and teachers? We're going to screen teachers too,
We are.
right? We want to screen everybody to get them in. How does that impact in the flow of instruction and master scheduling and lots of different things to think about? How about other nuances that you think would be important to think about when it comes to symptom
Well,
screening?
it certainly, from a safety and security aspect, challenges us. We want to get kids in the building as fast as possible. How do we do that when we're symptom screening? We're going to have face masks. What kind of face masks are kids wearing? Schools with maybe a gang population, we have to be careful of the color of face mask that we're wearing. Schools have to have strong policies on hats, because now with a hat and a mask we can't see who you are on a camera or visually, and I need to know who you are. So now we may have to go to an ID for our high school kids, because an adult could attempt to pretend to be a high school kid, and it makes it harder for us to figure that out. So from a safety and security aspect, we now have to look at the world a little differently in terms of our perimeter and how we secure the school. So that's just one component for us.
Any other thoughts about?
I think initially, for sure, no matter what procedures you start with, it's going to be timely. And it's probably going to be timely, but one thing we noticed is, and this happens whenever we institute something new, and you're not 100% sure on exactly how you're going to do it, exactly how you're going to document, it takes a little bit longer. And once everybody, for us, got used to the temperature checks and the questions, that procedure for us was quite quick. It's going to be a whole lot different when you were talking about Ralston Valley with 1,800 students. That's a whole other story than my 4 people in my fire station. But I think as, the first couple of weeks, or the first week may be the hardest if you're going back and you're doing some of these new measures. After that, I think it'll streamline slightly.
So I heard a couple of things in there that would be important for schools and school districts to think about. And that would be procedures ahead of time, right? Kids knowing ahead of time what's going to be expected so that you can implement it day one. So there's got to be some type of information sharing and expectation. The model school kind of piece I think was really helpful. We'll want to think about that for all of our normal fall traditions too. So registration, what will that look like? How will we take care of that in a way that honors all of the safety precautions but gets kids and families what they need? What are the conduct code expectations? What are the school supplies that kids are going to have to bring in? How do I find out who my teachers are? So these are all good questions for school districts to ask. It's not just the on day one when they get there, but what are some of our routines and rituals ahead of time building up to that?
How do teachers make that connection before the first day that you drop your kids off, right? Because if we're talking about limiting access into the buildings and some of those other things to protect the health of the building, it may be one of those places where the teacher, okay, here's your 30 kids. Before day one, you need to make contact with each of the parents, right?
Start building that relationship.
Build those relationships so that they do trust when they're dropping off kids.
So one thing I think that we've done to kind of hopefully help that situation, most of our teachers are contracted and most of our itinerant staff come back August 12th. School was scheduled to start August 18th. We have pushed that back by 1 week to August 24th in hopes that, you know, what you're talking about happens more. That gives the teachers a little bit more time to work with their administration, figure out how are we going to get these kids in a timely manner once we start screening them, and then really try to focus on, you know, help the parents answer their questions for them as much as we can and try to relieve some of that pressure and anxiety.
So it's not just once kids are at school, but it's how they get to school,
Right.
right? So busing, I'm sure there's lots of folks out there who are wondering about what are the questions we should be asking ourselves about transportation. So what are some things that you guys have been wrestling with?
Well, I think one of the questions is how many kids can fit on the bus. That's probably the number one question. And that doesn't come from us. It doesn't come from the state. That may come from the feds and the U.S. Department of Transportation dictating and determining what that's going to be. And then that puts pressure on the school district to make a determination of which students are you going to bus based on numbers and restrictions of how many you can get on a bus. And you know, the question that we came up with now is symptom screening before they get on the bus.
Right.
So there's a lot that goes with this.
Yeah.
And then what happens if you have a student that's symptomatic? Where do you leave them, or how do you leave them? What's the plan when you have a 6-year-old that all of a sudden has a fever that is presenting with symptoms, and how do we get a hold of parents to come get them before we drive off in the bus and leave a 6-year-old behind, which we don't ever want to do.
Right.
So these are all questions that every school district's going to have to answer. And if we don't do that right, then we're out looking for a missing student. And we don't want to be in that business either.
And I think the comfort level of parents is going to cause them to opt out of busing.
May see less
potentially.
riders, huh?
And so less riders means more neighborhood impact at the school facility as parents are dropping off. And you know, especially on those cold days, already around every school building, you know, for 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon, it's an absolute disaster.
As a principal, I used to deal with that all the time. People
Right.
would say, your parking lot's not big enough for all these people. And in the middle of the day, they'd say, your parking lot's really big. Maybe we could build an extra playground and have more space for kids, right? But there's those 2 times during the day, beginning of the day and end of the day, where everybody is coming all at once. And people are impatient. They want to get to work. They've got to, right? Or they got to pick up their kid for an appointment or get to soccer practice or whatever it is. So we're already a little bit heightened. Now we may be a little bit even more heightened. So those tensions, you're right.
I've seen some schools who've done really innovative things, bringing some of that traffic into their parking lot and routing it around. Communicating with parents, right? There's a school in Westminster Public Schools where the teacher or the principal assigned staff, and every morning they're in the hug and go lane, opening the door, reassuring parents everything's good, right? Hey, you're gonna have a great day today, kid. And everybody's in the building, and they have a 200-foot parking strip. It's really tight, but they make it work because they've pre-planned, they put the staffing there, they've communicated and set expectations with parents and families, and everybody knows how it's gonna work. So those types of new innovations, and as many of those as we can make stick post-COVID would be awesome,
There you go.
right?
That'd be good. That may look different too, right? So you just said the expectations incoming. So you might be used to, when I drop my young one off, I walk them to the door and wait with them. And I talk to the other parents about that. That's something we should be communicating with parents about if we're going to change that type of expectation, because that's part of their socialization as a community. And just like you were saying before, relationships matter. And all of a sudden, if they feel like the school is getting in the way of these relationships, it's important to talk about why and how it is that we're expecting kids to come and to go. I think about when I was a high school principal too, those student drivers. That's busy, beginning of the day, lunchtime, and end of the day, right? So lots of things to talk with our student drivers about, expectations and how that looks. I know we already try to work with them on expectations around number of students in a vehicle, packing them in, right? So we're going to want to think about all of those implications. Ben, you had something it looked like.
I was thinking about packing the kids in. I remember in high school, you get as many people as you can into a car, and
Yeah.
that's
We're all going to
exactly what
McDonald's.
we don't want to do here.
Right.
So.
Right. Good. Julie, did you have anything about busing?
So, one thing we have talked about with busing too is that importance of really getting the parents on board to know that we're trying to work in conjunction with them. So we really want to have all of our buses operating to the best of our ability. Maybe we're scheduling 2 or 3 different tiers as far as routes that go. And when we do that, we will need a lot of cooperation as far as them staying with their child until they know that they're safely on the bus. And I think that will be a big step for us. We're trying to work through, again, all of the complications that we talked about just now. But that is an area that will look much different than it has in years past.
How about field trips? Oftentimes, kids enjoy going on field trips and learning new things in the real world. Any implications for that? You're not going to touch that,
I
John?
don't know.
You're not going to touch that?
Yeah, that's not my expertise.
It's going to be hard.
Think about if you're the receiving agency, right? You're the Denver Nature and Science Museum.
Right.
Well, sorry, we're at our max. We can only take X amount of kids through the dinosaurs at any given time. So it's going to, here again, coordination with the partners. If it's something that is that much of a value add to the educational process, that it has to happen.
Just
And
like
maybe
those
it
other
doesn't
routines.
happen like it used to happen.
Right.
Maybe it happens in stages. Maybe we cut back 50%, 75%, and then we start adding in as the businesses even can handle it. We're just going to have to see.
Kind of like we talked about with the core purpose of those routines at the beginning of the year, right? Think about back to school night, parent-teacher conferences. Those still are all important things, just like learning from the real world is important too, but it may look and feel different. So we need to walk beside our parents and our kids so that they understand that we value those things, but they are going to look different.
I think something as simple as the field trip illustrates too that no matter what happens, there's going to be an added workload on everybody, and the mental stress that's going to be on everyone. We talked about teachers and masks and staff checking temperatures. The added stress that's going to be on all of the personnel in schools is going to be tremendous, and I think that's something that's going to need to be watched out for, whether we're overworking people or giving them too much. I think at some point there becomes only so much that you can take, and it's going to be important to watch out for each other during that time.
And so important from a leadership perspective. I know you all are leaders. To involve all of the people who are going to be impacted in the conversations about what it is that we feel we're going to need to do to be able to be safe, so that there is shared ownership and collective commitment to those things, so that it's us It's not somebody else tells us we have to do this. It's no, we're doing this because we agree that this is the most important thing to do right now to keep students and staff and families in our community safe, right? Works so much better when we can build that. Classroom configuration, you talked a little bit about model schools and being able to look at that. Are there some recommendations that you guys are wrestling with or kind of trying out around classroom and common spaces in a school building?
You wanna-
No, you go ahead.
We're trying to figure out how do we have 100% enrollment capacity while still maintaining 6 feet social distancing. In a lot of those situations, that may forego a bit. And because of that, we are going to implement our other strategies, making sure that, one of our mitigation strategies is the same cohorts, kids in the same cohorts, and those cohorts not intermingling with another cohort. Also having their masks on will be an important part to that. The hand hygiene will be an important part of that. Schedule times throughout the day to wash your hands, if not, making sure you use the hand sanitizer. Those configurations can be different in every classroom. We don't have a classroom size that's the same throughout every building. Some of our older buildings have smaller rooms, some of our newer buildings have bigger rooms. Every room is going to be different, and how the teachers configure their desks, or sometimes we don't even have individual desks, we have tables. So what does that look like as far as keeping kids a little bit further if you can? Also, the important aspect in that is, as much as possible, keeping them all the same distance, facing the same direction.
So you talked at the beginning about a cohort.
Yes.
How are you guys defining cohort?
It'll be different at each level. Elementary cohorts are going to be pretty much their class. Middle and high school, they're going to be intermixing a couple different cohorts together. Not intermixing them together, but they're going to have probably 2 to 4, hopefully, cohorts with middle and high schools. So rather than if we needed to quarantine, we would rather quarantine 4 different classes, so to speak, than doing the entire grade level. We feel that that would be a safer, more controlled option.
So I've heard some schools talk about the possibility of having teachers move instead of having kids move, so that there's not a bunch of kids moving in the hallways too, right? If the classroom allows for the content to be taught, right, if I'm teaching English and math and the teachers move instead of the kids all moving, then that may minimize some things.
Right, we talked about for art classes, art on a cart. So the cart may go to the different classes rather than the kids going actually to the art room.
And then working with your local health department, I would
Right.
assume, on if you wind up with a kid positive in a cohort,
Yes.
what that looks like and feels like and sounds like, those local experts would be the ones to help guide.
And it may be different each situation. So we're kind of going through right now, what do our procedures look like for that?
What about resources in a school, like school supplies? We often give kids a list at the beginning of the year, parents say, get these school supplies and bring them to school, and A through C, you guys are going to bring a bunch of pencils, and we're going to share all our pencils. We're going to share all, it seems like that may be something we need to.
We're trying to cut down on the amount of shared items as much as possible. Trying to get each kid to have their own as much as possible. If not, we'll have to do a really great job of disinfecting them in between student use.
Makes me think about things like textbooks at a high school. Very, very expensive, $130, $150, $200 for an AP textbook. And to combat that, some school districts have said we're going to just buy a classroom set and we're going to use the textbooks in class. If a kid needs to check it out overnight, I'll let them check it overnight, but we're not checking out individual books. We may have to rethink some of these things, right? Math manipulatives for younger children. What does that look like? We might have had a shared activity with shared manipulatives, passing back and forth, and now we may have to think more individually, and how do we disinfect those things? The library, checking in and out books at the library. Julie, you had said something.
It'll be a struggle. I mean, we're trying to configure space and how to walk, one-way pathways through the library, and can we make the librarian and the para in the library be the only 2 that touch the books, and then hand them out to the children? Is it best to let them sit and kind of for a few days, 72 to 96 hours, and let the virus completely destroy and die? let it sit there and without even trying to clean them. It's a little hard to
Let it
try
run
to
its course.
disinfect a book.
Yeah, yeah, all the different pages.
Right.
How about classroom volunteers and visitors? Part of building our community, right? It's the heart of the community, is how we welcome others to this partnership in educating our students together. I would imagine there'll be some pretty stark changes in the number of visitors and volunteers in classrooms.
Yep,
There
go
there
ahead.
will. And yeah, we just have to cut back on some of this. I mean, volunteers are going to be a challenge this year. And the more outside people we introduce to the students and the staff, the greater the risk. So that's a big discussion right now is what do we limit and what do we say no to? What are the hard and fast rules? And what can we allow?
So I would think back to our first comment too about connection and confidence of the community. We have to think about ways as a school and school district to still have those folks feel connected and informed and important and a part of the education that's going on there, right? Because there's such value in the volunteers and the parents who come to help. How do we still keep them involved and engaged, and what can they do?
They're incredible advocates and resources.
The other thing I think about is community, and the schools are seen as a resource within the community, a hub, right? That's utilized not just during the day for education, but it's used for all kinds of things. YMCA, basketball, and all kinds of things with the community. When I was a high school principal, I had people there every day, all day long, all weekend long, because it is a community resource. But with less control over some of those things that are happening with community groups that come in, we probably have to really think through, and school districts should think through, what is that going to look like, and how do I inform and walk beside the people who I might have to say no to for a while.
Right.
Well, one of the challenges that I can see happening throughout the state and certainly in our own district, it's not unusual for police department or fire department to call and say, can we use your school as an emergency shelter during a blizzard?
Or fire, right?
Or
We were
fire,
talking about fires
wildfire
today.
going on. Can we use it as an evacuation center? And typically we say, we'll open the doors
Absolutely.
and give you a hug as you come in. That's going to be different. So that's going to require our partners to start thinking outside the box about where else could they go. In some cases, I think in the mountain communities, there's very few spaces that even allow for that size of group other than a school to come into and evacuate to. So that really could play a part in how we operate as well.
We often use school buses to help with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just-
To help get people out and transport them to locations.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and back to Ben's point, right? All of this is going to fall to the staff that's in the building. So we have to make sure that we're taking care of those folks, right? Because you strip away all these other resources, right, and add on these additional layers of daily process and mission, it's going to take its toll. So
There are lots of things I think that school districts need to think about beyond the classroom and the core instruction as well. I think there are, I know, as having been a high school principal, there are so many wonderful activities and athletic and clubs and things that kids can get engaged in that keep them involved and interested in school. And in fact, they do better in school if they've had those opportunities. Those are things that school districts are going to have to think through too. How will those things look different? How do we still provide opportunities for kids, but in a safe way? In a safe way. So,
yeah.
okay. So I want to shift now to Tim and Ben a little bit and have you talk about how some of your procedures might be different now, because we talk about all the things going on in a school, but when things in a school are not going well, we have a student who is particularly ill, we have a fire in the school, we have something else going on in the school that we need the police for. When you all come, will things look or feel different at all based on some of your policies and procedures?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a good chance, especially if a student is feeling ill. Part of the tough thing about COVID is its wide variety of symptoms, and just we're almost forced to consider every case of respiratory to be a COVID case. So that might include somebody who's having an asthma attack. So depending on what the current regulations are, normally we would come in and we'd be wearing gloves and kind of dressed like I am right now. However, now we may have, we'll all have a mask on regardless, and it may be something as simple as this paper mask, or a lot of us will wear this half respirator. The reason that we're wearing these is just the cost of going through so many of these disposable masks was just through the roof, and as well as we couldn't get in 95s for a time. So this is a reusable thing. Oftentimes we'll be wearing a set of goggles such as that because of trying to keep our eyes protected. And something we may wear is kind of look like painters. It's a suit similar to this, maybe something that we're wearing. So we'll look completely different. And something on this psychological aspect for kids is going to be when a pretty standard response whenever we go to anybody's home dressed like that from neighbors is it's automatically assumed that there's something really bad going on. If we are dressed to that level, there's something really bad going on. And yes, this may be somebody who's having a really bad exacerbation of COVID symptoms, but it also may be something else. And it's just because when you play the game telephone, oftentimes the message gets mixed. So if a teacher has to tell an administrator to call 911 for us, that has to tell a dispatcher, that has to tell us, sometimes that information can get lost. And we've had incidents where we've had near misses because the information just got jumbled. And sometimes somebody's not thinking one way or another. So we have kind of at West Metro gone to a higher level of protection just so that we don't have responders go out ill with the symptoms. So for us to come in on a medical call, we may be dressed at a much higher level than people are experiencing, and that may cause a sense of panic between students where, you know, oh my gosh, I was in class with Jimmy, now I have it. So that may be something that just administrators, teachers, everyone's going to have to be aware of, that just because we're dressed like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's this big, huge incident.
So we want to talk to kids and families ahead of time too, right? Because
Yes.
they're driving up or driving through, dropping a kid off, and they see you all decked out in your gear and go, whoa.
And we also just send one responder in, which is different than what we do now. We're limiting our contact. So we'll have one person make contact, and you may see 3 or 4 of us standing off to the side, and you're kind of thinking, well, they're not doing anything. But that's just in our procedure to limit contact. So that's a big change for us.
Okay. And Tim, how about for your team?
I think the biggest thing for us is using hold more often, right? We've talked about limiting
hold.
So I
Not
mean,
necessarily a physical hold on a kid, but tell the
Right.
people who are listening what that means.
so in the SRP safety strategies, hold is an intermediate strategy where kids and faculty stay in a particular room that they're in when that hold is called. They don't have to change their behavior in the room, but they can't go out in the hallways. And what that allows us is clear lanes to get to that person to deal with whatever that problem is, and more importantly, protect that person's dignity, right? So people don't see us administering CPR or talking to Jimmy and then freak out. So I fully expect that, okay, you know, the principal calls in and the administrative team says, you know what, let's go ahead and put the school on hold right now so we can start putting those protective factors in place before EMS, fire, police is even on scene, and then we've got the best possible circumstances to work within. And it limits that exposure, right? I mean, it limits live cast, Facebooking, and all the rest of the social media platforms from showing whatever that is. We do that a lot already to protect folks, but I really see that strategy being used more often.
So again, this raises the importance of school districts and schools talking to their local partners about what may be different, because you have some things that may be different, but there's other responders who may have something completely different than what you all have going on too. So I don't want our listeners to believe that their responders may have the exact same protocols in place, because they won't, because the local guidelines are different, and like you said, their capacity and what they have access to may be different.
Our neighboring fire department that we run with Pleasant View quite a bit, their response is different than ours. So we may be working the same scene together, wearing different PPE, just based on different guidelines for every department.
That's a
Well,
great
I think
example.
One thing that schools can do that's really consistent across the board, if we have to call a fire department, unless the building is burning down for some reason and we're evacuating everybody, get somebody out to meet the fire department as they're showing up, to give them the needed intel about what's happening. Same thing with law enforcement. You know they're coming. It doesn't hurt, if it's safe to do so, to go out and meet them and let them know what the issue is, so that you have a briefing. They have the intel to work with, because intel drives our tactics, as we know, and that provides, I think, safer entry into the school, and we're all on the same page. That game of telephone then gets stopped the moment they arrive and start getting out of the cars and trucks.
And, sorry, I was going to say, that person also gives them access to the environment, the quickest path to whatever that problem is, right? Hey, if you can just pull the truck around to the other big door on the other side of the building, we can walk in and no one will see us.
And something that we've done that is a little bit counter to what we've always done is we've always gone into people. One of the tactics that we've changed with COVID is if a patient is able to, and I'll just use the home for example, if they're able to come meet us outside, we've asked them to start doing that so that we're no longer going into that environment. They come out into an environment that we control. There's limited exposure to the responders, so that may be something that schools may consider. If the individual that's in their clinic can walk out to us, that may be the best course of action.
Makes me wonder too about how school districts may need to relook at and think about their safety and security drills, practices, procedures. And obviously we won't talk in detail about any kind of tactics here, because we don't want to give tactics away, but in general, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves?
Oh, we're going to have to completely change a lockdown drill this year, and what a lockdown drill means, and how we educate students and staff. Fire drills are a great example of this. You know, typically it's a Congo line where they're all lined up next to each other. That's going to have to look differently. But then if you socially distance 6 feet apart with 5-year-olds, and you've got 20 of them, now you got 100 feet of 6-year-olds walking out. It's tough for one teacher to manage. So we're engaged in conversations internally, and we'll be engaged with our mission partners from fire and law enforcement in the next couple of weeks to create the processes and the protocols. Everything is changing, but it doesn't mean you have to stop doing the drill. It just looks a little different.
And this is that opportunity. This reemphasizes the need for pre-planning, right? Have those conversations early and often. Have it so the engine company that's in that district, the police officers that work that normally, they understand what that building looks like. We have a lot of different tools that can support the school's mission by putting up simple numbers on the doors, right? That has great value for us as we respond in, but it also provides a day-to-day operational foundation for the schools. Those simple conversations, anything that we can do to pre-plan, please do. And that's relationships right there. We're coming to the table, figuring it out.
The details matter
Absolutely.
in all of this.
So we're about to close, but before we close, there's something that Ben brought up that made me think about a question that we may want to ask Julie about, and that is health rooms and how they may look different, because there's a difference between a student who needs to go in and get a Band-Aid or their regular medication for the day, right? I have medication at 10 o'clock, versus a student who has started to show some symptoms. So any thoughts about questions school districts should be thinking through on that?
So I think for the most part, school districts really need to think about keeping the health room. And that means the everyday chronic conditions that come in to get their medications. I know for our school district, we have 27,000 different medications throughout the district. We need to keep the flow of that. We need to keep it going, procedurally the way it always goes. Need to take care of those kids that have normal treatments throughout the day. It's really important that we establish at each school a different room. You can call it the isolation room. That's really what it needs to be called. But in some cases, people don't like that term. You can call it whatever you want, but it's a designated room that is different from the health room so that you can put anybody that presents with one of those COVID-19 symptoms in that isolation room until they can go home.
And still providing spacing
Still
in that
providing
room
spacing.
and PPE in that room.
And
'Cause
PPE.
the kid may not really be, right? You might want to
Right.
think about entrance and egress from that room when you're
Correct.
thinking about how do I hand off to a parent who's coming to pick up a kiddo who is not
And
feeling
again,
well.
the best thing to do is to actually call the parent and walk them out rather than having the parent come in. So all of that will be, specialized training for our nurses, our health aides, the backups to the health room. All of that will be specialized training that we'll have to go through and work through some of those kinks. And again, practice and plan and the details matter.
Well, I want to just close by saying thank you to each one of you for being here. It matters. And thank you to all of those of you who were able to tune in. Please know just what we said at the beginning. Today we were only able to touch on a few items, a few questions that school districts should be beginning to ask themselves. We hope that in some way this conversation will lead you to be asking your own questions, turning to each other, turning to your community partners to make the most of the experts that you have available to you readily every day. I know we do that all the time. So the DeAngelis Foundation, again, is pleased to have brought you this conversation. You can find out more about the foundation by looking at www.deangeliscenter.org. Thank you.